Chapter 1. The Ledger of Debt. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed against her chest and made it hard to breathe. The air smelled faintly of old wood and stale coffee, a scent that had become synonymous with the countless arguments they'd had in this very room. She sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She didn't dare look up at him, not when his rage was so palpable it seemed to vibrate through the walls. He stood across from her, his broad shoulders casting shadow over the table. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle twitching beneath his skin. In his hand he held the ledger, a thick, leather-bound book that had become the symbol of her indebtedness. He slammed it onto the table with a force that made her flinch, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. 15 years! His voice boomed, shaking the very foundation of the house. 15 years I've spent on you, more than any bride price your family could ever dream of demanding. His words were sharp, each one a blade cutting through the fragile peace she had tried to maintain. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the grain of the wooden table, tracing the lines with her gaze as if they could anchor her. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of how trapped she felt. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat, heavy and unspoken. He flipped open the ledger with a violent flick of his wrist, the pages fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. "School tuition?" he barked, his finger sabbing at the page. "Paid, every semester, every book, every fee." His voice rose with each word, his anger building like a storm. "Food? Never once did you go hungry, not a single day. Clothes?" He gestured wildly at her, his eyes blazing. "Look at you, draped in the finest fabrics, walking around like a queen. And who paid for it? Mr. Always me." She felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her. The ledger was a testament to everything he had given her, a record of her indebtedness. It was a story she had never written, but one he had meticulously crafted. A story of obligation, of ownership. "Do you understand now?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Every penny spent on you has a price, and you owe me." Her hands clenched into fists beneath the table, her nails biting into her palms. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but the fear that had been ingrained in her for years held her back. She had spent so long trying to please him, trying to be what he wanted, that she had forgotten who she was. And then he said it, the words that cut deeper than any accusation. "You are my property." The silence that followed was deafening. Her ears rang as if the universe itself recoiled at his proclamation. She stared at him, searching for a trace of humanity in his eyes, but all she saw was cold calculation. He wasn't just claiming ownership over the things he had bought, he was claiming her. With a cruel smirk, he leaned in closer, towering over her. "Do you understand now? Every penny spent on you has a price, and you owe me." Her body stiffened, her hands curling into fists beneath the table. Rage and shame boiled in her chest, a toxic mix threatening to spill over. Her mind raced, not with fear, but with the burning realization that this wasn't love. It never had been. This ledger wasn't just a record of what he had given, it was a weapon, wielded to shatter whatever illusion of freedom she thought she had.
Chapter 2. The Whisper of Freedom.
She sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers digging into the blanket, as though anchoring herself to reality. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the small lamp on the nightstand. The shadows danced on the walls, twisting and shifting like the thoughts in her mind. Her heart was still racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she replayed the argument in her head.
"You are my property." The words echoed in her ears, a relentless reminder of how little control she had over her own life. She felt like a puppet, her strings pulled by a man who saw her as nothing more than an investment. The ledger had been the final blow, the proof of her indebtedness laid bare for her to see. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed Amina's number. Her closest friend, the one person who had always given her honest advice, even when it hurt. The phone rang twice before Amina's voice came through, groggy but alert. "Hello, are you okay?" Amina asked, concern lacing her tone. "Can we meet? I need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Minutes later, she found herself sitting in Amina's modest living room, clutching a cup of tea she hadn't even touched. The room was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of her own home. Amina sat across from her, arms crossed, her face stern yet concerned. "You're telling me," Amina began, her voice laced with disbelief, "that after all he's said, after all he's done, you're actually considering having his child?" Her words hit like a slap, but she had no energy to argue. Instead, she murmured, "He says it's the next step, that having a baby will make us a real family. He's been pushing me for weeks, Amina. What else can I do? If he demands repayment for everything he's done for me, how will I ever afford it? My family could never come up with that kind of money, and honestly, I don't even know where I'd start. It feels impossible." "Impossible?" Amina's voice sharpened, her eyes narrowing. "You're sitting here, telling me that your freedom and your dignity are worth less than a line item in his book of expenses. Do you hear yourself, or have you lost all sense of who you are?" She flinched, but Amina wasn't finished. "Yes, he paid for your school. Yes, he fed you and clothed you. Yes, he gave you shelter. But let me ask you this. Did he ever do it out of love, out of compassion? Or was it all just a transaction to him, a way to control you?" Her silence was damning. Amina leaned forward, her tone softening but still firm. "You're not indebted to him. You owe him nothing, least of all a child. Don't let him make you believe otherwise. A baby won't fix this. It won't make him love you or change how he treats you. He's not a husband. He's not a partner. He's not even a man worth the ground you walk on. And now you're telling me you'd rather give him a child than walk away with your head held high. You, of all people." Her throat tightened, and tears pricked her eyes. Amina's words cut deep because they were true. She hated how true they were. I'm scared, Amina," she whispered. "I don't know what life looks like without him. I don't know who I am without him. And what if I can't do it alone?" Amina sighed, her expression softening as she reached across the table to take her hand. "You don't have to know everything right now. You just have to take the first step. That man has built a cage around you, but the key has always been in your hands. You're stronger than this, stronger than him. A baby will only tie you to him for the rest of your life. You owe it to yourself and to the life you haven't created yet to break free from this cycle. You can rebuild, even if it means starting with nothing. But you can't do that if you're still carrying the weight of his lies on your back." The words sank in slowly, like a heavy stone settling at the bottom of a river. She stared down at her lap, her hands trembling. "But what do I even do, Amina? Where do I start?" Amina's eyes softened, her voice gentler now. "You start by saying no, by refusing to give him that power over you. And when you're ready, you leave. One step at a time. And I'll be here to help you figure out the rest. You're not alone." For the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself cry. But this time, the tears weren't just for her pain. They were for the life she had lost, and for the life she was determined to reclaim. Chapter 3. The Cold Night of Contemplation. The night air was sharp and biting, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. She sat on the stone bench just outside the compound gate, her thin scarf doing little to shield her from the chill. Her breath came out in visible puffs, dissipating into the darkness like fleeting ghosts. The street lamp at the far end of the road flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the cracked pavement. She hugged her knees to her chest, her fingers numb from the cold, but she barely noticed. The chill outside was nothing compared to the icy emptiness inside her. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more painful than the last. She replayed the argument in her head, his words echoing like a broken record. "You are my property." The words had cut deeper than any physical wound, leaving her raw and exposed. She had spent 15 years trying to please him, trying to be what he wanted. And for what? To be reduced to a line item in his ledger? to be told she owed him for the life he had given her. Her chest tightened, and she pressed her palms into her eyes as if she could block out the thoughts threatening to drown her. But they were relentless, swirling around her like a storm she couldn't escape. What kind of woman even considers leaving a man who's done so much? She thought bitterly, her hands clasping each other until her knuckles turned white. And yet, what kind of life am I living if it's all just debt, duty, and dread? The guilt gnawed at her relentlessly, a parasite feeding on her confidence. Every argument played itself out in her head, like two opposing voices battling for dominance. He's right, one voice whispered. You'd be nothing without him. He's built your life brick by brick, and now you think you can just walk away? But then came Amina's voice, strong and unwavering. You're not indebted to him. You owe him nothing, least of all a child. She clenched her jaw, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She hated this war inside her, hated how no matter what side won, she always felt like the loser. And then there was the loneliness, sharp and insistent, cutting through her like a cold wind. Despite the man she lived with, despite the roof over her head, she had never felt more abandoned. He was there, always there, but not with her. His presence felt like a shadow, cold and oppressive, rather than a source of comfort or warmth. Lately, his demands had grown louder, his obsession more suffocating. A baby will fix everything, he had said last night, his voice low and coaxing, but with that familiar edge of authority. It'll bring us closer together. Isn't that what you want? A family. But his idea of family felt more like another prison. She could already imagine it. A child tying her to him forever. Another life trapped under his control, his moods, his relentless expectations. She shivered at the thought. Her chest tightened, a wave of despair washing over her. Maybe this is it, she thought bitterly. Maybe this is all I'll ever have. A ledger of debts, a man who sees me as property, and a lifetime of shadows. She pressed her palms into her eyes, as if she could block out the thoughts threatening to drown her. But the tears came anyway, hot and silent, soaking into her skin. The next morning, as she walked to the market, she felt the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She didn't notice the way her shoulders hunched, the way her steps dragged. She was a woman folded in on herself, her sadness written plainly on her face. That was when she first noticed him. He was leaning against a fruit stall, talking to the vendor with an easy smile. His laugh rang out, light and unrestrained, like the sound of a life unburdened. It startled her, pulling her out of her haze for just a moment. She kept walking, averting her gaze, but then she heard him speak. Are you all right? His voice was soft, tentative, yet something in it made her stop. She turned, her heart racing, and found him looking directly at her. His eyes were kind but searching, as though he could see the storm raging beneath her skin. She started, but her voice caught in her throat. You seem, I don't know, tired, he said, stepping closer, his tone careful. Like you've been carrying too much. The honesty in his words hit her like a blow, and she had to look away, afraid he might see too much. I'm fine, she managed, though her voice trembled. He didn't press her, but his gaze lingered as though he didn't quite believe her. If you ever want to talk, I'll be around. With that, he turned back to the vendor, leaving her standing there, stunned. She walked away quickly, her mind racing with a mixture of confusion and guilt. Who was he? And why had he even noticed her? Later that night, she lay awake in bed, his words replaying in her mind. There had been no malice, no ulterior motive, just a simple, genuine observation, and for the first time in years someone had seen her. Not her debts, not her obligations, not her failures, but that only made her guilt heavier. How could she even think about someone else when her life was still so entangled? How could she let herself feel seen when she barely knew who she was anymore? The man in her life, the one who claimed her as his property, had always made it clear she was his, and only his. But now, for the first time, she felt the faintest whisper of something else. The idea that maybe, just maybe, she could belong to herself. And that whisper terrified her. The air was cool that evening, the kind of chill that seeped through her thin scarf and pressed against her skin. She pulled her coat tighter around herself as she walked down the dimly lit alley, her footsteps echoing softly against the cobblestone. The distant hum of the city was a comforting white noise, drowning out the thoughts she couldn't bear to face. It had been another heavy night at Amina's, a conversation filled with hard truths and painful reminders of what she already knew deep down. She didn't owe him anything. She owed herself everything. But the thought of acting on it felt like trying to breathe underwater. As she rounded the corner, she stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. There he was, Khalid. Leaning casually against the brick wall, his hands tucked into his pockets, as though he had been waiting for her all along. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He watched her with those steady eyes of his, the kind that seemed to look past the surface and straight into the chaos she tried so desperately to hide. "You're out late," he said finally, his voice soft but laced with concern. Her heart raced, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. I was just heading home," she said, her voice faltering. He smiled faintly, pushing off the wall and stepping toward her, but his movements were slow, unthreatening. "I thought I might see you," he said. "You seemed distracted the last time we talked." "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly. The words came out sharp and defensive, and she hated how obvious it sounded. Khalid tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Are you?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. Her resolve crumbled under his gaze, and she felt the tears she had been holding back threaten to spill over. She looked away, her eyes darting to the cracked pavement beneath their feet. "Why are you here, Khalid?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To make sure you're okay," he replied simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I'm fine, really." He took another step closer, closing the space between them, but still keeping a respectful distance. "You don't have to lie to me," he said softly. "Not with me." His words struck a chord deep within her, and she felt her defenses falter. She wanted to tell him everything, the weight she carried, the guilt that consumed her, the fear that paralyzed her. But the words stuck in her throat, heavy and unyielding. "I'm just tired," she admitted finally, her voice cracking under the weight of the admission. "I know," he said gently, his eyes filled with a kindness she wasn't used to. "You've been carrying so much for so long. It's okay to feel tired." Her chest tightened, and she blinked rapidly, willing the tears not to fall. She hadn't realized how badly she needed to hear those words until now. Khalid reached out then, his hand brushing against her arm lightly, as though testing the boundaries of what she could handle. "You're not alone," he said. "You don't have to do this alone." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside her, and before she could stop herself, a single tear slipped down her cheek. She turned away quickly, embarrassed by her vulnerability, but Khalid didn't pull back. "I'm here," he said softly. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." For a long moment, they stood there in the quiet of the alley, the world around them fading into the background. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to a kindness she hadn't felt in years. "I should go," she said finally, her voice trembling. Khalid nodded, stepping back to give her space. "Okay," he said, "but if you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." She nodded quickly, not trusting herself to speak. As she walked away, her footsteps hurried and uneven. She felt his gaze follow her, steady and unwavering. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop replaying the encounter in her mind. The way he had looked at her, the way his words had wrapped around her like a safety net. For the first time in years, someone had seen her, not her debts, not her obligations, not her failures, her. And that thought terrified her. Chapter 4. The House of Shadows. The house felt colder when she returned that night, as though the walls themselves knew she was hiding something. She closed the door quietly, but the sound still seemed to echo through the silent living room. She froze, her heart pounding as she glanced toward the armchair. He was there, waiting. His posture was casual, one leg crossed over the other, but the sharpness in his eyes betrayed the anger simmering just beneath the surface. He had been waiting for her, just like he always did when she came home late. "Where were you this time?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm, his eyes narrowing as they followed her movements. "With Amina," she said quickly, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her chest. She busied herself with taking off her scarf and coat, avoiding his gaze. She hoped the lie would land as it always did, unquestioned. But tonight, he wasn't letting it go. "You've been with Amina a lot lately," he said, standing now, his movements slow and deliberate as he crossed the room toward her. "Don't you think it's a little odd? All these late nights? All this secrecy?" His voice grew sharper with every word. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. "We're friends. We talk. That's all," she said flatly, willing her voice not to waver. He scoffed, shaking his head as a bitter smile tugged at his lips. "You think I don't see what's happening?" he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "You think I'm blind? You're lying to me, and you're not even trying to hide it anymore." Her heart raced, but she forced herself to keep moving, brushing past him toward the kitchen. "I'm not doing this tonight," she muttered, her voice low. But he wasn't letting her off that easily. He followed her, his footsteps heavy behind her. "You're not doing what? Answering my questions? Explaining why you come home smiling like you've been handed the world, only to shut down the moment you walk through that door?" She froze, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as his words sank in. He was watching her, every move, every flicker of emotion. It felt suffocating. "There's nothing to explain," she said quietly, refusing to turn around. "You're imagining things." He laughed then, the sound cruel and humorless. "Imagining things? You think I don't notice how different you've been? The way you dress, the way you smile when you leave this house? You think I don't see it?" Her chest tightened, her breath shallow. She turned to face him, her hands trembling at her sides. "I've done nothing wrong," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. He stepped closer, towering over her now, his face inches from hers. "Then prove it," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell me the truth. Who is he?" Her stomach dropped, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. "There's no one," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened. "Don't lie to me," he spat. "After everything I've done for you, after everything I've given you, you think you can make a fool out of me?" "I'm not lying," she said, louder now, her voice breaking under the pressure. "There's no one else." His hand slammed down on the counter beside her, making her flinch. "You're lying," he hissed, his face contorted with anger. "I can feel it. You think you can play games with me? You think some other man is going to take you in, fix you? He won't. No one will." Her breath hitched, tears stinging her eyes as his words hit their mark, sharp and cutting. "You're mine," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "No one else will ever love you the way I have. No one else will ever put up with you. That night, as she lay in bed, his words echoed in her mind, intertwining with Khalid's. You're stronger than you think, Khalid had said, his voice gentle and unwavering. No one else will ever love you, he had sneered, his words laced with venom. She pressed her hands to her temples, willing the voices to stop, but they only grew louder. The anger, the fear, the flicker of hope, it all warred inside her, pulling her in different directions. She turned to look at him lying beside her, his back turned. His presence loomed like a shadow, heavy and oppressive, even in sleep. Her fingers curled into the blanket, and for the first time she allowed herself to think about leaving. Not just in fleeting, terrified moments, but in real, concrete terms. What would it take? Where would she go? Who would she become? She wasn't sure if she had answers to any of those questions, but for the first time, she was willing to ask them. The confrontation came suddenly, like a storm that had been brewing for weeks, but finally tore through without warning. It was a Sunday evening, the kind of night that was meant to be quiet, uneventful. She was sitting on the couch, her phone in her hand, staring at Khalid's last message. Sooner or later you'll have to decide, not for me, but for yourself. She didn't hear the door open at first, but she felt the cold air sweep into the room as he entered. She looked up and froze. The man she had lived with for 15 years stood in the doorway, his face twisted in fury. He had something in his hand, a crumpled piece of paper, and when she realized what it was, her stomach dropped. It was the note Khalid had written to her last week, one she had foolishly tucked into her purse and forgotten to remove. You want to tell me what this is? He snarled, throwing the paper onto the coffee table in front of her. Her heart pounded in her chest. It's nothing, she stammered, reaching for it, but he slammed his hand down on the table, stopping her. Don't lie to me, he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. Who the hell is Khalid? Her blood ran cold. This was it. The moment she had been dreading, the moment she had tried so desperately to avoid. She stood slowly, her legs trembling. He's just someone I know, she said weakly. Someone you know? His voice was venomous, dripping with mockery. Don't insult my intelligence. You've been sneaking around behind my back, haven't you? While I've been here providing for you, giving you everything, you've been out with him. It's not like that, she cried, her voice breaking. Oh, isn't it? He spat, stepping closer to her. His face was inches from hers now, his breath hot and furious. Then what is it, huh? Tell me, what does he have that I don't? What lies has he been feeding you, that you're special, that you deserve better, that you're not used property? She flinched at the words, but her silence only seemed to fuel his rage. You're pathetic, he hissed. 15 years I've given you, 15 years of my life, wasted on someone who doesn't even appreciate it. And for what? So you can run off with some nobody? Her fists clenched at her sides, anger rising in her chest. Don't you dare call him that, she said through gritted teeth. His eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with a dangerous glint. So it's true, he said quietly, his voice low and menacing. You've been with him. You've been betraying me. I haven't betrayed you, she snapped, her voice trembling with fury. If anything, you betrayed me. You've spent 15 years treating me like a possession, not a person. You've controlled me, manipulated me, made me believe I was nothing without you. But guess what? I'm done. His laugh was cold and cruel. Done? You think you can just walk away? You think he'll take you in? Fix you? You're mine. You always will be. Not anymore, she said, her voice steady now, her heart racing with adrenaline. I'm done being yours. Chapter 5. The Choice. The house was eerily quiet after the confrontation, the kind of silence that felt heavy and oppressive, like the calm before a storm. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. The screen was blank, but her mind was anything but. The argument replayed in her head like a broken record, his words cutting deeper each time. You're mine. You always will be. She hated how those words still had power over her, how they made her feel small and insignificant. But for the first time, she also felt something else. Anger. It burned in her chest, a fire that refused to be extinguished. She was tired of being told what she was, tired of being treated like property. She was tired of living in fear. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was Amina. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. Hello? Are you okay? Amina's voice was filled with concern. You sound off. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I'm fine, just tired. You don't sound fine, Amina said bluntly. What happened? She hesitated, unsure of how much to say, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. He found out about Khalid. He's furious. He said I'm his property, that I always will be. Amina was silent for a moment, and then she sighed. I'm sorry. I know how hard this must be for you, but you need to remember why you left in the first place. He doesn't own you. No one does. I know, she said, her voice trembling. But it's not that simple. He's been a part of my life for so long. I don't know who I am without him. You're stronger than you think, Amina said firmly. You've already taken the first step by standing up to him. Now you need to decide what comes next. But whatever you do, don't let him control you anymore. She nodded, even though Amina couldn't see her. I'll try. Good, Amina said. And remember, you're not alone. I'm here for you no matter what. She hung up the phone, feeling a little lighter, but still weighed down by the enormity of the decision she had to make. She knew Amina was right. She couldn't let him control her anymore. But the thought of leaving, of starting over, was terrifying. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dark street below. The city was alive with lights and noise, but she felt disconnected from it all, like she was watching from a distance. She thought about Khalid, about the way he had looked at her, the way he had made her feel seen. But she also thought about his recklessness, his betrayals. Could she really trust him? Or was he just another man who would let her down? And then there was the man she had left behind. He had never cheated on her, never strayed, but he had also never truly seen her. He had controlled her, manipulated her, made her feel like she owed him everything. Was that any better? She didn't know. And that was the problem. She didn't know what she wanted, what she deserved. All she knew was that she couldn't keep living like this, trapped between two men who saw her as something to be owned. The next morning she found herself at the market again, her feet carrying her there almost without thought. She needed to get out of the house, to clear her head. The market was bustling, the air filled with the sounds of vendors calling out their wares and customers haggling over prices. She moved through the crowd, her mind still swirling with thoughts. And then she saw him. Khalid was standing by a fruit stall, his easy smile and relaxed posture a stark contrast to the tension she felt. He looked up and saw her, his eyes lighting up with recognition. He waved her over, and before she could think better of it, she found herself walking toward him. Hey, he said, his voice warm and welcoming. You look like you could use a friend. She hesitated, unsure of what to say, but then she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I could. He smiled and gestured to the stall. Come on, let's get something to eat. My treat. They sat on a nearby bench, sharing a bag of fresh fruit. The sweetness of the mangoes and the tartness of the oranges were a welcome distraction from the chaos in her mind. For a little while, she allowed herself to forget about the ledger, about the man who claimed to own her, about the choice she had to make. But eventually, the conversation turned to heavier topics. Khalid looked at her, his expression serious. You've been quiet. What's on your mind? She hesitated, unsure of how much to share, but something about his openness, his kindness, made her want to trust him. I'm just tired, she said finally. Tired of feeling like I don't have control over my own life. He nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. I get that. It's hard to feel like you're stuck in a situation you can't escape. Yeah, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know what to do. I don't know how to start over. Khalid reached out and gently took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one step at a time. And remember, you're not alone. I'm here for you no matter what. She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to break free. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about Khalid's words. She thought about the man who had controlled her for so long and the life she had built with him. And she thought about the future, about the possibility of something new. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, she felt like she had a choice. And that was enough. She closed her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting a pale glow across the room. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind still racing from the events of the previous day. The confrontation with him, the encounter with Khalid, the weight of the decision she had to make. It all swirled in her head like a storm she couldn't escape. She sat up slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. She knew he was still there, somewhere in the house, waiting. He always waited. But for the first time, she didn't feel the usual dread at the thought of facing him. Instead, she felt a strange sense of resolve, a quiet determination that had been building inside her. She got out of bed and dressed quickly, her movements deliberate and purposeful. She didn't know what the day would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep letting him control her, couldn't keep letting him dictate her life. She walked into the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. He was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in his hand, his expression unreadable. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Morning," he said, his voice calm but laced with an edge she couldn't quite place. "Morning," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. He watched her as she moved around the kitchen, his gaze heavy and unrelenting. She could feel it on her, like a weight pressing down on her shoulders, but she refused to let it break her. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around the warm mug. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm. She could feel the tension between them, a palpable force that seemed to vibrate in the air. Finally, he broke the silence. "We need to talk." She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "About what?" "About you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "About what you've been doing behind my back." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I haven't been doing anything behind your back." He laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Don't insult my intelligence. I know about Khalid. I know you've been seeing him." Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Khalid is a friend. That's all." "A friend?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You expect me to believe that? After everything I've done for you, after everything I've given you, you think you can just throw it all away for some nobody?" Her hands clenched into fists beneath the table, her nails digging into her palms. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm just trying to figure out what I want." What do you want? He said, his voice dripping with disdain. What you want is to be grateful for what you have. What you want is to stop acting like a spoiled child and start appreciating everything I've done for you. Her chest tightened, and she felt the familiar sting of tears in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was tired of crying, tired of feeling like she owed him something. She was tired of being told what she was, what she should be. I am grateful, she said, her voice trembling but firm. But that doesn't mean I have to live like this. That doesn't mean I have to let you control me. His eyes narrowed and he leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. You don't get to decide that. You're mine. You always will be. She shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. Number, I'm not yours. I'm not anyone's. I'm my own person, and I deserve to be treated like one. For a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable, and then he laughed, a cold, cruel sound that made her blood run cold. You think you can just walk away? You think you can just leave me, after everything I've done for you? She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she stood up. I'm not leaving you. I'm leaving this prison you've built around me. I'm leaving the ledger, the debts, the control. I'm leaving all of it. He stood up too, his face dark with anger. You're not going anywhere. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. But she refused to let him intimidate her. Yes, I am. And you can't stop me. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the tension between them crackling like electricity. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved quickly, her hands trembling as she grabbed her bag and stuffed a few essentials inside. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know what she would do. All she knew was that she couldn't stay here, not anymore. She heard his footsteps behind her, heavy and deliberate. You're not leaving, he said, his voice low and dangerous. She didn't respond, her hands shaking as she zipped up her bag. She could feel him getting closer, his presence looming over her like a shadow. You're not leaving, he repeated, his voice rising slightly. She turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. Yes, I am. For a moment, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable, and then, without warning, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. You're not going anywhere. She struggled against him, her heart pounding in her chest. Let me go. He didn't respond, his grip tightening as he pulled her closer. She could feel his breath on her face, hot and angry. You're mine. You always will be. She twisted in his grip, her heart pounding in her chest, and then, without thinking, she brought her knee up, hitting him squarely in the stomach. He let out a grunt of pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to pull away. She didn't wait to see his reaction. She grabbed her bag and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she bolted out the door. She didn't stop running until she was several blocks away, her chest heaving as she leaned against a wall to catch her breath. Her hands were trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a strange sense of freedom. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know where she would go or what she would do.
Chapter 7. The First Step. The streets were alive with the hum of the city, but she barely noticed. Her heart was still racing, her hands trembling as she clutched the strap of her bag. She had no plan, no destination in mind. All she knew was that she couldn't go back. Not now, not ever. She walked aimlessly, her feet carrying her through the maze of narrow alleys and bustling streets. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a bird that had been caged for too long and suddenly set free. The world felt vast and overwhelming, and she wasn't sure where she fit in it. Her mind raced with thoughts, each one more chaotic than the last. What do I do now? Where do I go? She had no money, no place to stay, no one to turn to except Amina. The thought of her friend brought a small measure of comfort. Amina had always been there for her, always been the voice of reason when she felt lost. She pulled out her phone, her hands still shaking, and dialed Amina's number. It rang twice before her friend's familiar voice came through. Hello, are you okay? Amina's voice was filled with concern. Uh, I I left him, she said, her voice trembling. I couldn't stay any more. I had to get out. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then Amina's voice softened. Where are you now? I don't know, she admitted, her voice breaking. I'm just walking. I don't know where to go. Okay, Amina said, her tone calm and reassuring. Listen to me. You're going to be okay. I'm going to help you. But first, I need you to tell me where you are. Can you do that? She looked around, trying to get her bearings. The streets were unfamiliar, but she spotted a small cafe on the corner. I'm near a cafe called the Golden Cup. It's on Elm Street, I think. Okay, good, Amina said. Stay there. I'm coming to get you. Just stay put, okay? Don't go anywhere. She nodded, even though Amina couldn't see her. Okay, I'll wait. She hung up the phone and leaned against the wall of the cafe, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. The adrenaline that had carried her this far was starting to fade, leaving her feeling drained and hollow. She closed her eyes, taking deep breaths to steady herself. It didn't take long for Amina to arrive. She pulled up in her small, beat-up car, her face filled with concern as she jumped out and ran over to her friend. Are you okay? Amina asked, her eyes scanning her face for any signs of injury. I'm fine, she said, her voice trembling. I couldn't stay there anymore. I had to leave. Amina nodded, her expression softening. I'm proud of you. That couldn't have been easy. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. It wasn't, but I couldn't keep living like that. I couldn't keep letting him control me. Amina pulled her into a tight hug, her arms warm and reassuring. You're safe now. You're with me. We'll figure this out together, okay? She nodded, burying her face in Amina's shoulder as the tears finally spilled over. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a small measure of peace. They sat in Amina's car, the engine idling as they talked. Amina had brought her a bottle of water and a sandwich, which she nibbled on absent-mindedly. Her appetite was non-existent, but she knew she needed to eat. So what's the plan? Amina asked, her tone practical. You can't stay on the streets, and you can't go back to him. Do you have anywhere else to go? She shook her head, her stomach churning at the thought. Number, I don't have any family nearby, and I don't have any money. I don't know what to do. Amina was silent for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. Then she nodded, as if coming to a decision. You'll stay with me. For now, at least. We'll figure out the rest as we go. She looked at Amina, her heart swelling with gratitude. Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Amina said firmly. You're my friend, and friends help each other. Besides, my couch is pretty comfortable. You'll be fine. She managed a small smile, the first one she'd had in what felt like forever. Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you. Amina grinned, her eyes twinkling. You'd probably still be wandering the streets, looking lost and dramatic. Now let's get you home. Amina's apartment was small and cluttered, but it felt like a sanctuary. The walls were covered in colorful artwork, and the air smelled faintly of incense. It was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment she had left behind. Amina showed her to the couch, which was already made up with a blanket and pillow. It's not much, but it's yours for as long as you need it. She nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. It's perfect. Thank you. Amina smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. Get some rest. We'll figure everything out tomorrow. She lay down on the couch, her body sinking into the soft cushions. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. The weight of the day pressed down on her, and she felt herself drifting off to sleep. But as she closed her eyes, her mind wandered back to him, to the life she had left behind. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she had a chance to start over, a chance to be free. And that was enough. Chapter 8. The First Night of Freedom. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old building settling. She lay on Amina's couch, staring at the ceiling, her mind refusing to quiet down, despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on her body. The events of the day replayed in her head like a disjointed film. His rage, her escape, the frantic call to Amina, and now this, her first night of freedom. Freedom. The word felt foreign, almost too big to grasp. She had spent so long living under his shadow, under his rules, that the idea of making her own choices felt overwhelming. Her chest tightened as she thought about him, about the life she had left behind. Would he come looking for her? Would he try to drag her back? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, and she pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Amina's soft snores drifted from the bedroom, a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone, but even so, the silence felt heavy, pressing down on her like a physical weight. She turned onto her side, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. Sleep felt impossible. The sound of a kettle whistling woke her. She blinked, disoriented, as the events of the previous day came rushing back. The couch, the blanket, the faint smell of toast, it all reminded her that she wasn't in her old home anymore. She sat up slowly, her body stiff and aching, and rubbed her eyes. Amina appeared in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of tea. "Morning," she said cheerfully, handing her one. "How'd you sleep?" She took the mug, the warmth seeping into her hands. "Not great," she admitted, "but better than I thought I would." Amina nodded, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "First night's always the hardest, but it'll get easier. You'll see." She sipped the tea, the familiar taste of chamomile calming her nerves. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have a job, no money, no plan. I don't even know where to start." Amina leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "First, we take it one step at a time. You're safe here, and you've got time to figure things out. But if you're ready, we can start making a plan today." She nodded, her chest tightening at the thought. "I'm ready. I don't know where to begin." "We'll start with the basics," Amina said, her tone practical. "You'll need a job, a place to stay long term, and maybe some legal advice, depending on how messy things get with him. But for now, let's focus on what you can control." Later that morning, they sat at Amina's small kitchen table, a laptop open in front of them. Amina had pulled up a list of job openings in the area, and they were scrolling through them together. "What about this one?" Amina asked, pointing to a listing for a receptionist position at a local clinic. "It's part-time, but it's a start." She hesitated, her stomach churning at the thought of stepping back into the workforce after so long. "I don't know if I'm qualified. I haven't worked in years." "You're smarter than you give yourself credit for," Amina said firmly. "And you've got skills. You just need to believe in yourself." She nodded, though the doubt still lingered. "Okay, I'll apply." They spent the next few hours filling out applications, Amina coaching her through each one. By the time they were done, she had applied to 5 different jobs, her hands trembling slightly as she clicked "Submit" on the last one. "See, that wasn't so bad," Amina said, grinning. "Now we wait." 2 days later, her phone buzzed with a notification. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the email. It was from the clinic. They wanted to schedule an interview. She showed the email to Amina, who let out a whoop of excitement. "I knew it! You're going to crush this." The interview was scheduled for the following morning, and she spent the rest of the day preparing. Amina helped her pick out an outfit, a simple blouse and skirt that made her feel confident, and practiced answering potential interview questions with her. "Why do you want to work here?" Amina asked, playing the role of the interviewer. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I'm looking for an opportunity to grow and contribute to a team. I'm organized, detail-oriented, and I enjoy helping people." Amina grinned. "Perfect. You've got this." The clinic was small but welcoming, the walls painted a soft blue that reminded her of the ocean. She sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to calm her racing heart. The receptionist called her name, and she stood, smoothing her skirt as she followed her into the office. The interviewer was a kind-looking woman in her 40s, with warm eyes and a gentle smile. "Thank you for coming in," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Let's get started." The questions were straightforward, and she answered them as best she could, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. When the interviewer asked about her previous work experience, she hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. "I haven't worked in a few years," she admitted, "but I'm eager to learn and ready to contribute." The interviewer nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's all we can ask for. Thank you for your honesty." She was walking back to Amina's apartment when her phone buzzed. It was the clinic calling to offer her the job. Her heart leapt into her throat as she answered, her voice trembling with excitement. Yes, I accept. Thank you so much. When she hung up, she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. She had a job. She had a chance to start over. That evening she and Amina celebrated with takeout and a movie. As they sat on the couch laughing at the ridiculous plot of the film, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she was moving forward. As she lay in bed that night, her mind wandered to him. She wondered if he was looking for her, if he was angry, if he even cared, but for the first time, the thought didn't fill her with fear. She had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life, and no matter what happened, she knew she wouldn't go back. Chapter 9. The Shadows of the Past. The days began to blur together as she settled into her new routine. The job at the clinic was a welcome distraction, giving her a sense of purpose and structure. She enjoyed the work, organizing files, greeting patients, and assisting the staff. It was simple, but it was hers. For the first time in years, she felt like she was contributing to something meaningful. But even as she adjusted to her new life, the shadows of her past lingered. She found herself looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see him waiting for her at the end of the street. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat, fearing it might be him. She had changed her number, but the fear remained, a constant undercurrent in her thoughts. One evening, as she walked home from the clinic, she noticed a familiar figure standing at the corner of the street. Her breath caught in her throat and she froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It was him. He looked different. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and there was a wildness in his eyes that she had never seen before. He stepped toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "There you are," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've been looking for you." She took a step back, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag. "What are you doing here?" "I came to take you home," he said, his tone calm but laced with menace. "You belong with me. You always have." Her chest tightened and she shook her head, her voice trembling. "Number, I don't belong to you. Not any more." His eyes narrowed and he took another step closer. "You think you can just walk away? You think you can leave me after everything I've done for you?" She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm not leaving you. I'm leaving the life you built for me. I'm leaving the control, the debts, the ledger. I'm leaving all of it." For a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable, and then, without warning, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. "You're not going anywhere." She struggled against him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let me go!" He didn't respond, his grip tightening as he pulled her closer. She could feel his breath on her face, hot and angry. "You're mine. You always will be." She twisted in his grip, her heart pounding in her chest, and then without thinking she brought her knee up, hitting him squarely in the stomach. He let out a grunt of pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to pull away. She didn't wait to see his reaction. She grabbed her bag and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she bolted down the street, and she didn't stop running until she was several blocks away, her chest heaving as she leaned against a wall to catch her breath. Her hands were trembling, her heart pounding in her chest, but for the first time in a long time she felt a strange sense of freedom. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Amina's number. It rang twice before her friend's familiar voice came through. "Hello, are you okay?" Amina's voice was filled with concern. "I I saw him," she said, her voice trembling. "He was waiting for me. He tried to he tried to take me back." Amina was silent for a moment, and then she sighed. "I'm coming to get you. Stay where you are." Amina arrived a few minutes later, her face filled with concern as she jumped out of the car and ran over to her friend. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" She shook her head, her hands still trembling. "Number, I got away. But I don't know what to do. He's not going to stop. He's going to keep coming after me." Amina nodded, her expression serious. "We'll figure it out. But for now, you're coming with me. I know a place where you'll be safe." They drove in silence, the tension thick in the air. She stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts. She had thought she was free, but now she wasn't so sure. He wasn't going to let her go that easily. The safe house was a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. Amina led her inside, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The interior was sparse but clean, with a small kitchen, a living room, and a single bedroom. "You'll stay here for now," Amina said, her tone firm. "It's not much, but it's safe. He won't find you here." She nodded, her chest tightening at the thought of being alone. "What about you? Will you stay with me?" Amina hesitated, her expression softening. "I'll stay as long as I can, but I have to work, and I can't be here all the time. You'll be okay. You're stronger than you think." She nodded, though the doubt still lingered. "Okay, I'll stay." That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, she felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. The encounter with him, the fear, the uncertainty, it all swirled in her head like a storm she couldn't escape. But as she closed her eyes, she thought about the life she had left behind. She thought about the ledger, the debts, the control, and she thought about the future, about the possibility of something new. I bet she didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she had a choice, and that was enough. Chapter 10. One evening, as she walked home from the clinic, she noticed a familiar figure standing at the corner of the street. Her breath caught in her throat, and she froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It was him. He looked different. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and there was a wildness in his eyes that she had never seen before. He stepped toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "There you are!" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've been looking for you." She took a step back, her hands trembling as she clutched her bag. "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be near me." He laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "You think a piece of paper can stop me? You think you can just walk away?" Her chest tightened, and she shook her head, her voice trembling. "I'm not going back, not ever." His eyes narrowed, and he took another step closer. "You're mine. You always will be." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Number, I'm not yours. Not any more." For a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. And then, without warning, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight and painful. "You're not going anywhere." She struggled against him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let me go." He didn't respond, his grip tightening as he pulled her closer. She could feel his breath on her face, hot and angry. "You're mine. You always will be." She twisted in his grip, her heart pounding in her chest, and then, without thinking, she brought her knee up, hitting him squarely in the stomach. He let out a grunt of pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to pull away. She didn't wait to see his reaction. She grabbed her bag and ran, her heart pounding in her chest as she bolted down the street. She didn't stop running until she was several blocks away, her chest heaving as she leaned against a wall to catch her breath. Her hands were trembling, her heart pounding in her chest, but for the first time in a long time she felt a strange sense of freedom. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Amina's number. It rang twice before her friend's familiar voice came through. "Hello, are you okay?" Amina's voice was filled with concern. I saw him," she said, her voice trembling. "He was waiting for me. He tried to take me back." Amina was silent for a moment, and then she sighed. "I'm coming to get you. Stay where you are." Amina arrived a few minutes later, her face filled with concern as she jumped out of the car and ran over to her friend. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" She shook her head, her hands still trembling. "Number, I got away, but I don't know what to do. He's not going to stop. He's going to keep coming after me." Amina nodded, her expression serious. "We'll figure it out, but for now, you're coming with me. I know a place where you'll be safe." They drove in silence, the tension thick in the air. She stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts. She had thought she was free, but now she wasn't so sure. He wasn't going to let her go that easily. The safe house was a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. Amina led her inside, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The interior was sparse but clean, with a small kitchen, a living room, and a single bedroom. "You'll stay here for now," Amina said, her tone firm. "It's not much, but it's safe. He won't find you here." She nodded, her chest tightening at the thought of being alone. "What about you? Will you stay with me?" Amina hesitated, her expression softening. I'll stay as long as I can, but I have to work and I can't be. The restraining order had been in place for weeks and life had settled into a fragile rhythm. She had returned to her job at the clinic, her co-workers welcoming her back with warm smiles and quiet understanding. Amina had become a constant presence in her life, her unwavering support a lifeline in the storm. For the first time in years, she felt like she was breathing, truly breathing without the weight of his shadow pressing down on her. But freedom, she was learning, was not a destination. It was a journey, one filled with unexpected twists and turns. And tonight, that journey would take her to the edge of something she couldn't yet name. It was a Friday evening, and she was sitting on the couch in Amina's apartment, flipping through a magazine she wasn't really reading. Amina burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement. Guess what? Amina said, holding up 2 tickets. We're going out tonight. She raised an eyebrow, her heart skipping a beat. Out where? There's a new art gallery opening downtown, Amina said, grinning. I thought it would be fun. Get you out of this apartment for once. She hesitated, her stomach churning at the thought of being in a crowded space. I don't know, Amina. What if he's there? Amina's expression softened, and she sat down beside her. He's not going to be there. And even if he is, he can't come near you. You've got the restraining order, remember? You're safe. She nodded, though the doubt still lingered. Okay, let's go. The gallery was a sleek, modern space filled with vibrant paintings and sculptures. The air buzzed with conversation and laughter, the clink of glasses and the soft hum of music creating a lively atmosphere. She clung to Amina's arm, her heart pounding as they moved through the crowd. See, Amina said, squeezing her hand. This isn't so bad, is it? She managed a small smile, though her nerves were still on edge. Number it's nice. They wandered through the exhibits, Amina pointing out her favorite pieces and making her laugh with her commentary. For a little while she allowed herself to forget about the fear, to lose herself in the beauty of the art and the warmth of Amina's presence. It was as they were standing in front of a large, abstract painting that she noticed him. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp features, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity. There was something about him, something familiar, though she couldn't place it. He caught her gaze and held it for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips, and turned away. She felt a strange flutter in her chest, a mix of curiosity and unease. Who is that? She asked Amina, nodding in his direction. Amina glanced over and shrugged. No idea, but he's cute, isn't he? She didn't respond, her eyes following him as he moved through the crowd. There was something about him, something that made her feel both drawn and wary. Later, as she was standing by the refreshment table, he approached her. Up close, he was even more striking, his eyes a deep, piercing blue that seemed to see straight through her. Enjoying the exhibit? He asked, his voice low and smooth. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Yes, it's beautiful. He smiled, his gaze lingering on her face. I'm glad. Art has a way of speaking to the soul, don't you think? She hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I suppose so. He held out his hand. I'm Daniel, by the way. She shook his hand, his grip firm but gentle. I'm Sarah. It's nice to meet you, Sarah, he said, his smile widening. Do you come to these things often? She shook her head, her nerves starting to ease. Number this is my first time. Well, I hope it won't be your last, he said, his tone warm and inviting. There's a lot of beauty in the world if you know where to look. She felt a strange flutter in her chest, a mix of excitement and apprehension. There was something about him, something that made her feel both safe and unsettled. As the evening wore on, she found herself drawn to Daniel, his easy charm and quiet confidence a welcome distraction. They talked about art, about life, about the things that mattered most. For a little while she allowed herself to forget about the past, to lose herself in the moment. But as they were saying their goodbyes, Amina pulled her aside, her expression serious. Be careful, she said, her voice low. I don't trust him. She frowned, her heart skipping a beat. What do you mean? Amina hesitated, her eyes scanning the room. I don't know. There's just something about him, something off. She nodded, though the doubt still lingered. Okay, I'll be careful. That night, as she lay in bed, the silence of the apartment pressed down on her like a suffocating weight. The faint hum of the city outside did little to drown out the storm raging in her mind. Daniel's face kept flashing before her eyes, his sharp features, his piercing blue gaze, the way his smile had seemed both inviting and dangerous. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just his charm or his confidence, it was the way he looked at her, like he could see straight through her, like he knew things about her she hadn't even told him. She turned onto her side, clutching the blanket tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. The encounter at the gallery replayed in her mind. His voice low and smooth, his words carefully chosen, his presence both comforting and unsettling. She had felt drawn to him in a way she hadn't felt in years, but there was also a nagging unease, a voice in the back of her mind whispering warnings she couldn't ignore. Amina's words echoed in her head. Be careful, I don't trust him. She sat up abruptly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The room felt too small, the walls closing in around her. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, pacing the floor in an attempt to calm her racing thoughts. But the more she tried to push Daniel from her mind, the more he seemed to take root, his presence lingering like a shadow she couldn't shake. She walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to stare out into the night. The street below was empty, the glow of the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. She half expected to see him standing there watching her, waiting, but the street was silent still. And then her phone buzzed. She froze, her heart skipping a beat as she stared at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. Her hands trembled as she opened it. You can't run forever. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, her breath catching in her throat. She dropped the phone as if it had burned her, her mind racing. Was it him? Had he found her? Or was it someone else? Someone she didn't even know was watching? She picked up the phone again, her fingers shaking as she typed a response. Who is this? The reply came almost instantly. You know who? Her stomach churned, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. She glanced around the room, her heart pounding as if he might burst through the door at any moment. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. She grabbed her bag, shoving her phone and a few essentials inside. She couldn't stay here. Not tonight. Not when the walls felt like they were closing in. Not when the shadows seemed to move on their own. But as she reached for the door, it swung open before she could touch it. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat as Daniel stepped inside, his expression calm but unreadable. Going somewhere? He asked, his voice smooth and low. She stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. How did you get in here? He smiled, a small, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. You left the door unlocked. Lucky for me. She took a step back, her mind racing. What do you want? He stepped closer, his gaze intense. I told you, Sarah, I'm not here to hurt you. She shook her head, her voice trembling. Then why are you here? He reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. Because you need me, whether you realize it or not. She pulled away, her chest tightening with a mix of fear and something else, something she couldn't quite name. I don't need anyone, not any more. He tilted his head, his smile widening. We'll see. And then, before she could react, he turned and walked out the door, leaving her standing there, her heart pounding and her mind racing. She stared at the empty doorway, the silence of the apartment pressing down on her like a physical weight. She didn't know what to do, didn't know what to think. All she knew was that the fragile sense of freedom she had fought so hard for was slipping through her fingers, and she wasn't sure if she could hold on.